Welcome back. This is the second video of this short series about creating a REST API using Symfony 5. In the previous video we did a bunch of things. We created an environment, some Docker containers to run our environment. We did it using a public package which I host publicly on GitHub. You can go and download it. It's actually this one. It's called OP Codes, which is me. Docker SF. Didn't think of a better name. Docker Symfony stands for. So you simply download it, clone it on your machine, and then you copy it into Symfony project. And we created this Symfony project using Composer and the skeleton from Symfony's website. You'll find a link somewhere to go and see the previous video if you missed it. So yeah, as I said, we have this Docker environment. We have to run it. So we get into our project folder. We have this Docker folder, which is where the magic happens. Let's say we get in here and we're gonna say compose Docker compose up -d to run it in foreground, in the background, sorry. So it spins up the services and then gives you back the prompt. And using these tool, which I like to use, setup, we can see that we have our Apache, PHP and Redis machines, containers running. So now if we go to our browser and we say localhost, we can access the website pointing to localhost. So configuration is working. Now we can start writing some code. As I mentioned before, I will try and do so following the principles of the test-driven development, which consists in writing tests before you write your actual code. So what I'm gonna do, the first thing, I'm gonna write a test to which verifies that the services are up and running and the system responds. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna create a new test. I'm gonna call it I am alive controller test, and I'm putting it in the root because so we'll speak about directory structure if you want later on, but there are several approaches you can follow, but this controller which we are going to test now, it's not really part of the system anyway, so we're gonna keep it outside of everything, just as a functional, the main functional test. This test will tell us if the system is up and running. So this test will extend web test case from the Liip functional test bundle we installed before. What this does, it gives us the ability to easily create a client for our functional tests. So we annotate this and say this is a test, and we say handle maybe, what we're gonna do, we're gonna do this client, create client. Okay, so we're gonna have a client. Bear with me, this is kind of new for me as well. We create a client and then we're gonna say client. The client can do a bunch of things: get requests, get response, click, you know, it's a bunch of stuff we can use to log in user. We have a request, submit, and so on. So yeah, it's a client request where we're gonna configure the request and tell him what to try and get, right? So client request with a bunch of parameters. In particular, we have our method, which is get, and our URI, which is going to be something like /I am alive. And that done, we can assert this, assert equals. We want to assert that we get 200 response. So we say this client, client get response, get status code. Now if we run this test, test is going to fail. And it's going to say no route found for I am alive. And this is because we didn't define a route yet. So what we're going to do, we're going to go in config. We're going to grab our route configuration file. And we're going to say I am alive. Path is going to be /I am alive. The controller, which will handle this, is going to be up I am alive controller. So now we created the path, the route. We try and run the test again. Try and run the test, and it will fail, of course. And it's going to say a different thing. It's going to say that the controller up I am alive controller does not exist. So now we have the route, but we don't have the controller that handles this route. So what we're going to do, as we said, we're going to create it in the root of our source folder. I'm going to say I am alive controller, namespace up, it's correct, and probably we simply gonna have a public function handle which return a response, Symfony response, return new response, and response we could set a bunch of parameters, the content, I am alive, and the status though it's by default at 200 status success, so we're not gonna do that. Now if we run our test. The controller it's not callable. Controller app I am a live controller cannot be called without a method name. Alright, this is because in our root we didn't specify the method. And there you go, a nice green color, and our test has passed. So as you can see, this approach makes you really think about what you're doing. You start by asserting something, and then from there actually you start by utilizing something which doesn't even exist. So your test fails and you say, oh, I don't have a root. You go and create it, and then it will fail for some other reason. And as you go, you create the code responsible for your behavior, and in the end you expect your test to pass. When that passes, you know that the system behaves exactly as you wanted it. Okay, we can now start writing some code for the actual application. Let's continue with the same approach, test driven, so tests first. I'm gonna keep the same namespaces in the tests. It's a sort of a good practice. It's gonna be easier to find the tests. Let's do it like this and have them plural, so all the controllers are going to be in here. Alright, and so let's say new PHP class. Let's call this quotes endpoint controller. Actually, this is a test. Okay, and I love how PHP Storm is smart. So it will extend what? Let's start from a web test case. Let's see if we can make it how functional we can go. So public function, it retrieves tests. Yeah, so let's annotate it as a test. So now what we're gonna need is a client to make a request. Alright, so we have a client. We're gonna set a request. Which is going to be a GET request, and a URL, and as the URL, if we look at our documentation, here it says it wants to call something like our domain shout Then there is the famous person name as part as the URL, and then it starts with query parameters where it sets the limit, which we're gonna deal with later. So let's say shout, right? Slash shout slash a famous person, which we still don't know, and let's deal with the limit later. Actually, would be nice already. One more test is, I can already think of one more test, which is gonna be this one. If the parameter is missing, it fails with missing required parameter, which is the famous person. But to do this, we have to implement a few things. So let's start with this first one. So we have this one, and then we want to assert something, right? We want to assert, let's say, how we're gonna assert. I think on top of my head we could have some sort of fixture, some mock response, some mock JSON response, which, yeah, mock, I think it's the key. We can, because the controller will use internally a provider, right, which will, in this case, read a JSON file and give us back the results, give the controller back the results. Then the controller will serialize them or whatever and send those results back to us, and we could mock that provider in this test and make it return that fixture I was talking about. Yeah, probably. So let's say this assert JSON, let's see. Alright, so assert JSON string, which is what we get back from the controller using the mock provider. It's gonna be, so assert JSON string equals JSON file, which is gonna be our file. So the expected is gonna be the file, and the JSON is what we get back. So this client, no, actually it's not this, it's client get response. The file, let's create it in here, new, in a directory called fixtures. We're gonna create a new file called quotes and JSON. Let's start from here and then we'll see. And so here we will say dot fixtures. Shouldn't it autocomplete? Something wrong? Who knows? So yeah, dot fixtures quotes dot JSON, and we will see what to put in here. Let's get there step by step. So if we run the test now, we're gonna miss the root. It's gonna fail because the root doesn't exist. What's going on? Oh, here it is. Sorry, my laptop, it's starting to give bad signs. reactivity. So file controller does not exist in routes. So it's complaining about this. I see, I broke it. I broke it when I renamed controller in controllers. Because you see here it's looking for this controller, app controller, and in fact it says which is imported by annotations. Okay, so let's try and leave that controller alone. That controller folder that was there, I don't really know what's needed for. But let's create him a controller directory which was there, and I think he had inside a git ignore file. Yep, so controllers. Now we have our controllers instead, which we can do in a nicer way probably. But let's try the test first, if this makes us proceed somehow. And here we are, the controller does not return a response. Yeah, and this is about our quotes, right? Yes, quote and point. So yeah, apparently we're okay. And our point must return a new JSON response with an empty body or an empty JSON object maybe. That's it. JSON response. Alright. So that should be fixed. Let's see what else comes up. Okay, the file doesn't exist because we didn't create it yet, right? Fixtures, quotes JSON. So file does certain that quotes JSON. This is interesting. We are in the test. Controllers. Fixtures, right? Should be correct. Controllers, fixture. So let's see if we do like this, it doesn't do anything. We do like this, it doesn't autocomplete. So we really don't know where we are. Let's try and start from there then. Which is actually some magic stuff that goes outside, and then from there we go back one folder. Yep, so now it finds it and it says that an empty string is valid JSON. File asserting that an empty string is valid JSON. Now who knows? It's probably gonna be from quotes JSON because it's empty, right? Because in the controller we're returning an empty JSON object. And this is the response with the headers. So I suppose we need to tell him something else. It's gonna be get client, get response, get what? Get content probably. Okay, so JSON string equals JSON file. So let's see the differences. Oh, here it is. Expected, empty string, empty object, actual. So maybe this is not JSON encoded. And let's give it an empty array instead then. No, it's complaining about something else. It doesn't want to tell us. So XJSON is missing. Add XJSON to composer. Alright, but it might work anyway. And then we're gonna fix that error. So, well, not error, that highlight thing. So no. Expected, actual. So we expect the file, we get the response. All right, let's check about that JSON response. Yeah, so I've not been working with JSON responses that much recently. I completely forgot. The JSON response always converts it automatically into JSON and always wants a data. So in case you have structured data, you would have some sort of name, John, something like this. And in this case it would fail, because then I changed accordingly our fixture as well. And we can remove this dump. As you see, it was returning us the JSON. So if we run it now, we're gonna have a failure saying that data name JSON doesn't match data empty. And if we change this back to data empty and we run the test again, it then passes, but we are far from done. We now have a couple of ways to proceed. We might decide to leave this test alone for the moment and focus on the object that will retrieve the codes and pass them to the controller we're testing here. But this, on top of my head, doesn't sound correct, because this test could be, we could forget to get back to this test. Let's think about a more complex application. and this test would pass, but the controller is actually broken, doesn't do what we want it to do, right? So I would say that we continue from here and we start asserting what we want actually, right, to happen. Now this brings to a couple more things to consider. So this is a functional test, right? We're extending web test case, and if this would have been a PHP unit test, maybe we could have instantiated the controller, which will have something that will retrieve the quotes for him, some sort of provider or something. This provider will be, of course, injected through dependency injection, but in the test we might think about instantiate the controller manually and pass through the constructor the repository as a mock, and by doing so we could control the return, what this mocked provider would return. This is something we cannot do here because we are actually calling the actual controller, and we have no control. The controller it's created through dependency injections, Symfony's dependency injection, and the real objects are in there. So we don't really have this choice. Now we could think, okay, I did a bunch of stuff off screen because this is the first time I'm doing this, and I'm a bit, I need to think straight, and it's difficult to do it. Air quotes on camera. So first thing I did is I managed to get rid of that error, which was where I think it was in the provider, which it was not really an error. Here it is. It was, this thing was highlighted, and I cannot live with highlighted code in my PHP storm. And it was complaining, saying that the Json extension was missing in Composer. What you need to do is you go in your Composer and you say, okay, it requires a Json extension, and that fixes that. Then we left at the point where I was thinking of redefining, or actually defining the controller in my services, and pass that provider as parameter to it. And what I actually ended up doing is I added XML services, which is first of all what I do at my job, what we do at my job, and so I'm used to it. It's much easier. I like the syntax much more. It's much more intuitive, and also you get auto-completion, which you don't get in YAML, and it's always nice, right? So let's get rid of this, which we don't need. To do so, I had to add a bit of code, particular this snippet here, in the kernel PHP, which is you're actually allowed to do. It's the only file that it's in the source folder when you first install Symfony, and it's a way to configure, custom configure your Symfony application. So if you want to change something, as you see here, the only thing it does, it has some functions to configure the container and configure the routes. And in particular, I wanted to configure my container. This is what's there by default. So it deals, So it deals with YAML files, services, and services PHP. And also it gets all the configuration in this package folder up here, which is the cache, the framework, and the routing. And it then goes into the environment specific, so production and test, and it overrides the routing or the framework accordingly. So what I did, I added my XML services, which probably I will add after this. There's probably no need, as I won't change the the YAML services anymore, having the XML ones, but the order is important. So as you see what's happening here, it loads, it imports into the container the YAML services, or the services defined in the YAML file, and then it imports the services for the specific environment, so production or test. You can have some dev environment you can add if you want, and it from the YAML file. So it would be here if you had a where is it? Sorry, services underscore test dot YAML would be loaded at this point. And what this actually does is, if you override a service definition here, actually if you define a service here which is already defined here, it will override it. And that's how you have two different environments. Yeah, so I did the same, and I'm importing my services from my XML, and I'm importing my services from my environment specific XML. And these are the two new files I created. And so what I did, I created a service for our provider and a service for our controller, which once accepts an argument, which is the provider. And then what I did is, in my test environment, I created an alias to the provider service, and I called it test provider, and I overwritten our controller service in the way that it now uses this service, this test provider service, instead of the actual one. What this allowed me to do was to actually go here and say get set that test provider that you have, set it as this mock object. And I needed to do so because actually I should have said this before. What happens is, from Symfony 3.4, is it this one? Yes, all the services are private by default. So when I went on to say set up provider, so the actual service with this mock object, it was complaining, saying that I can show you. It will complain and say that the service is private and can't be overwritten. Here you have it. The service is private and you cannot replace it. So that's why I created the test one, and I'm injecting it in the. I'm injecting that one in our test environment. I'm injecting that test one into our app controller, so that now I am allowed. Oh, and actually the key point here is, you want this directive or this, I don't know how to call it, in your XML file, saying that the services you are defining from now on are all public. So as this one, it's loaded in the kernel. After this one, it will replace the existing services and make them public, and which means that now you have control over it, over them, and so we can override them. And so yeah, we have our request, and here I was just dumping, and because I said how it's possible that the test is passing, I'm returning something different, but I'm actually still returning the same thing, because I set up the provider to return some dummy stuff for the moment, but then in the controller I'm still not using it. I'm still just returning an empty quotes object. So that's what we're gonna do next. We already have the provider in the constructor, so we have it available here. All we're gonna do is we return a new JSON response, and what our provider is gonna return actually. Our provider is gonna return some JSON. So probably we need to do something like JSON response. I think there is something like from JSON string, from JSON, yeah. Let's triangulate this and see. Import class from JSON not found. Yeah, because I don't think this is the right one. I think it's from. So I was remembered properly. Our PHP storm tricked us, but it's from JSON string, and we pass the string. So from JSON string wants a string data, yeah, and the status and the usual stuff, but that will be set by default. And now that we have these, which is going to be returned to us, if we run our test again, it should fail. Yep. And this is what we get from our provider, which is working. You can check the difference, the actual value from our provider and the expected one. And we're back. So I ended up not going for lunch, but getting stuck with this stuff. And so I realized what was going on. Problem was that in my roots I was calling the controller this way, and apparently Symfony, when you do that, doesn't use the service you define, but the actual class. It took some time to understand that, but as you see now, I'm calling it with the notation used to define the service. So now we have the service serving the root, and here in the actual services didn't really change anything. We have the real provider serving the we have the real provider passed to the controller, and then in the test environment, what we do in the controller, we use this test provider, which is defined here still as an alias of the real one. So this one, we don't need it. I ended up trying some mockery stuff. I created a mock class, but I didn't like it. I can't test it properly. It doesn't really respect the TDD, test-driven development rules, let's say. So I ended up removing this stuff and insisting on my approach, and I fixed it apparently. So now we have this test service defined here as an alias, and then in our this one we don't need it. This one is that mock that I was telling you before. We can remove it, and we can remove it from here as well. And in the test, at some point I gave up and I said, okay, it returns a successful response, and it fails when there is a missing parameter. Then I got back to it. I wanted to insist, so I did the same thing. I created a mock. I mocked the method and make him return mocked bar instead of the full bar returned for now by the real provider. And then the client calls the root. He asserts we have a successful response, as we said here, and I removed the assertion about the content will get there again. At the moment I'm just dumping the content of the response, which is mocked bar, and it's what we are mocking here, right? So if I run it again, let's see now, removing all that stuff, I didn't break anything. Yeah, we have it, and the test passes. This one I wanted to show you. There is some strange stuff going on with Symfony. This thing, when you call a root which wants a required parameter, and you don't pass the required parameter, internally a not found exception it's thrown and says no root found. But then it's thrown and caught internally. It doesn't really break anything, and in the end we end up getting anyway a response with a status code 404. Even though this thing doesn't do anything, there's no way to silence it. One thing I found around was to create a test kernel where sort of a null logger was created, and you can force the application in the test environment to use that test kernel here. I didn't like it because there was no way to say which exceptions to silence, so if I do some mistakes in my codes, I want to see them, I want to see my exceptions. So I decided not to go that way. I will live with this, even if I don't like it. I will live with this this error here, which is not really an error. The behavior is correct. I expect that 404 response, and I get that 404 response. Assertion is passing. It's just an output there, red output. But it's Symfony. We can't really do anything about that. So now we want to do our assertion here. So we want to say this assert JSON, what is it? JSON string equals JSON string. And in there we're gonna put this thing and the response coming from our client, actually to our client from the controller, which uses the provider which we mocked here. So we expect to return exactly the same thing, and this will probably pass now. Yep, so we have that. Cool. I would say that our job with the controller is finished here. We check the success response, and we check the failure because of a missing parameter, and not only we assert that we get a successful response, we also make sure that the content of that response is what our controller has been served by our provider, which we mocked in this case, but that's okay. Next, we will go and write the logic for our provider.